for Schoharie Crossings Lunchbox lesson number 4, Erie Eats with Derrick Pratt of the Erie Canal Museum. I'm Dave from Schoharie Crossing. It's a joy and a pleasure to bring another fantastic online presentation to you out there in the inner cyber webnets world. And hopefully you're going to be checking this one out and some of our other programs and online resources, either on YouTube or on our Facebook. You can always get a hold of us, Schoharie Crossing at parks.ny.gov, or find us on the web, find us on Facebook for more on that. But you're not tuned in to hear me talk. You're here for Derrick Pratt, who is the educator and interim curator at the Erie Canal Museum in beautiful downtown Syracuse, New York. It's housed within the old Waylock building, and they offer fantastic programs both in person and online. You can also find out more about their wonderful information on their website. I put that up on the chat here, and it will be posted up on our Facebook and YouTube later, along with the video. And you can check them out, especially their YouTube channel, which I find extremely exciting and engaging, entertaining, and educational. I know Derrick has a lot of great videos up on there, Erie Eats, and some of his travels along the canal as well. They have a new exhibit, Erie Eats, which is open throughout the rest of the year. And it is fantastic to have Derrick here to speak on the Erie Eats Project and any of the other interesting stuff he might be of interest to the audience. So with that, thank you very much, Derrick Pratt. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Glad to be here. Thank you to Schoharie Crossing for hosting me. I would also like to quickly thank the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor and the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, who were able to provide the funding for our entire Erie Eats program throughout this whole year. We've got an exhibit. We're doing talks like this. We have programs like David mentioned, so on and so forth, and none of them would have been possible without that initial funding. I also just want to quickly forewarn, now that we've started recording, I've already told the audience here this, but I forgot my notes for this talk at home, so we might be a bit sparse at times on some of the statistics. But I have no doubt we will still have a fun talk here on the history of foodways and the Erie Canal. So let's go over a few basic questions we have to ask before looking into foodways. First, what is the Erie Canal? What is the Erie Canal Corridor? What are we defining as the Erie Canal Corridor? And what are foodways? These are three things we're going to have to keep in mind throughout this presentation. First, the easy one, the one that I get paid the most to talk about, I guess. What is the Erie Canal? And that also happens to be the easiest one at this point. So the Erie Canal, we have that here. A 363-mile long artificial waterway connecting Lake Erie and the Great Lakes here at Buffalo to the Hudson River at Albany, and then obviously from the Hudson River, the Atlantic Ocean. So merging the great interior seas of the United States with the actual ocean, if you will. Overcoming 571 feet of elevation change, which is impressive in itself, but obviously the main reason, not obviously, but the main reason why the Erie Canal is so important, why it was built where it was, is due to the natural gap in the Appalachian Mountains right here along the Mohawk River Valley, which is an essential piece of knowledge to know when understanding the Erie Canal, that we have this incredible natural gap in the Appalachians, the lowest pass through those mountains between Georgia and Maine. And we're going to talk a lot about the Mohawk River Valley coming through. To overcome that, they had to To overcome that elevation change, 83 locks were used on the original canal. Eventually, they expanded it. We had less, but keep those locks in mind. They are going to play an important part in our story. And overall, the project cost a little over $7 million in the New York State budget, as it was a New York State funded entity. And it is still owned by the state of New York today. And just for context, as I've realized now that we're talking about multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure projects, this seems like a paltry amount, but it represented a massive chunk of New York State's budget in the early 1800s when it was constructed. I forgot to add that. The Erie Canal constructed, we're celebrating its bicentennial of its construction between 1817 and 1825. So, we've only got 4 more years to milk that bicentennial. But that's the era we're looking at. But before we talk about that, sorry, like I said, working without notes here. I forgot the slides in. So that's the Erie Canal. Typically, when we're talking about the Erie Canal corridor, I like to think of anywhere within 25 miles of the canal. The Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor generally sticks around that, I believe, but it varies depending on the area. But in what I'm talking about, we're going to call the Erie Canal corridor 25 miles-ish along the canal, around the canal. Though we are also going to see that the foodways affected by the Erie Canal extend far beyond just the canal's banks and that 25-mile kind of corridor, if you will. But anyway, the most important thing now, what are foodways? Defined as foodways are the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food. It's often referred to the intersection of food in culture, traditions, and in history. So that's what a foodway is, and there is a massive history of foodways along the Erie Canal and the Erie Canal corridor as this is defined. And that's why we chose to do this Erie Eats program here at the Erie Canal Museum, because there is so much history, there's such a broad story there, and also because we're all connected to foodways. Everyone, at least somewhat, understands within themselves foodways because we all have to eat. This is a way we hope to kind of connect with more audiences and bring more people to the table here. So now let's really get into foodways of the Erie Canal. To do that, first we are going to start out before there was an Erie Canal. Right now, I would like to acknowledge that where I am today, here in Syracuse, we are on the land of the Onondaga people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Onondaga were the firekeepers of the Confederacy. Similarly, the Haudenosaunee Nation stretched all the way across upstate New York, and this is their land. It was often illegally taken from them by Anglo-European settlers. But let's talk a little bit more about the Haudenosaunee before the Erie Canal. They've been here for thousands of years and had a robust agricultural society, largely focused around these 3 plants, what are known as the 3 sisters: corn or maize, beans, and squash. Squash has there's a lot of different types of squashes, including pumpkins. But on top of those three, which are planted together because they are able to, they cohabitate in an incredible fashion. The corn grows up first, which then provides sort of trestles for the beans to grow up along. And then at the base of the mounds that Haudenosaunee typically plant these three sisters together in, at the base grow these squash, which their broad leaves offer shade, which provides enough shade for moisture to kind of stick around all three of the plant's roots, and their broad leaves also deter insects from getting to any of the plants. Also, the beans, they're a rare plant that replenishes nitrogen in the soil, so it makes it so you can have a more sustainable crop. It's really an incredible system of companion planting. That's what it's called nowadays. So you've got this. The Haudenosaunee, they'll augment their diets in a number of different ways with maple trees. They're able to take the sap of maple trees and use that in a number of really ingenious ways. A number of fruits and berries in the area. Strawberries have a major importance in Haudenosaunee culture, and then also it would be augmented with hunting and fishing. And the Haudenosaunee had incredible strategies for land management dealing with that. We often wrongly suppose that there's this kind of noble savage myth that exists, that it was just wild nature that existed kind of in upstate New York and the Americas before Europeans showed up. That is not true. Many indigenous peoples altered the landscape considerably, including the Haudenosaunee, to make it fit their needs. A large part of that was kind of intentional brush fires, which would clear land for agriculture, but it would also scare the animals in a specific direction. You could then catch those animals wherever they ran to, and it also created an interesting ecosystem where a meadow and a forest meet, which is actually more biodiverse than just a forest by itself or a meadow by itself. So I find that fascinating. And you can probably learn more about that. We have an upcoming talk by David Stradling, who wrote this book, The Nature of New York. That's coming up August 12th here at the Erie Canal Museum. That I believe he will be talking a lot more about that. But anyway, moving on. The Haudenosaunee largely consumed stews and soups, which we will find early European settlers also eat a lot of stews and soups. And European settlement of upstate New York really starts in the 1600s. The Dutch start moving into the Mohawk Valley. There they introduce a number of food products that are going to be very important to our story going forward, such as wheat and livestock, specifically cows. They're going to play a major part as well. There's a lot of cultural exchange that goes on during this time period, both violently and peacefully. But European settlers learn a lot from the Haudenosaunee, while the Haudenosaunee also learn about a number of agricultural practices and objects from Europeans. So mostly it is just the Mohawk River Valley that gets settled by Europeans in the colonial era. First there's the Dutch, then come Palatine Germans, various British immigrants settle there, set up small farms. But those farms largely focused on subsistence strategies because transportation is rather difficult on the Mohawk, and then if you go any further into the interior of the state, it just gets even harder to move things. So it becomes cost prohibitive to really grow for markets. That's another thing we're going to talk a lot about is the cost efficiency of moving food products to markets and having ready markets for you, because the market economy is going to radically alter the foodways of upstate New York. But before we get there, we have to talk about something else that radically altered the foodways. That is the Sullivan campaign. General John Sullivan, ordered by George Washington in the Revolution to attack the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and essentially to starve them by destroying their crops and many of their villages, especially around the Finger Lakes. It amounts to genocide, and thousands of Haudenosaunee, those who aren't killed in the raids, thousands more starved to death over that winter and are forced as well to relocate, often moving closer to Canada or into Canada, which also largely clears out sort of upstate New York for further European settlement. And after the Revolution, we're going to start seeing people, a lot of Anglo-American European settlers flooding into what was then known as the Genesee country. One of those people is this man, Jesse Hawley, who in the early 1800s sets up a flour milling and forwarding business in the Finger Lakes, because he recognizes that the Genesee Valley and a lot of land here in upstate New York is incredibly fertile. And he thinks, great, we'll grow a lot of wheat, everybody eats bread, and I'm going to make a fortune off of this. Well, he was right about those two things, but he was not right about the making the fortune, because he found that transportation to and from the Finger Lakes to any market that actually wanted to, that was large enough to economically sell grain to, it was incredibly difficult to get to them because you had to use the natural waterways at the time, which were generally pretty rough, very kind of unsteady. Sometimes, like, there was Wood Creek out by Rome was an essential part of this trade network, and that is like a tiny little creek that wouldn't have water in it sometimes, etc. There's tons of waterfalls on Mohawk, around the Seneca River, etc. There's rapids. It's tough to move goods, including grain, and the key to selling grain is to make it as cheap as possible at a market. Otherwise, there are a million other people can make grain too, and if your grain's more expensive, you're going to be outcompeted. And that's what happened to Jesse Hawley. He got outcompeted by a lot of times merchants in the Hudson River Valley. That was kind of America's, at least New York State's, breadbasket at the time. Hudson Valley was producing a lot of this wheat, which they could easily ship down to places like New York City on the Hudson River, which was a very navigable river. Anyway, Jesse Hawley's business loses tons of money, and he ends up going to debtor's prison. And that is where he becomes important to our story, because in debtor's prison, he writes the Hercules letters, which become tremendously influential in the history of the canal. As Hawley, sitting in his jail cell in Canandaigua, he maps out a route for a canal that would stretch from Lake Erie to the Hudson River, which, even though he had no engineering background, ends up conforming very closely to what will eventually become the Erie Canal. And those letters get to people like Dwight Clinton, among others, who were highly influenced by them, and they want to build this canal that Jesse Hawley is proposing. And that is what they do a decade later, starting in 1817. They start digging the canal. So like I said, it takes 8 years to dig the Erie Canal. And those laborers, while sometimes paid in cash, this is another Foodways connection though, they were often paid, at least in part, in kind with food and whiskey as well, or alcohol. So along with lodgings, you would generally get, your canal contractor would give you food and lodging and plenty of alcohol. I believe Common Labor by Peter Way. Sorry, I was looking at the book itself. He estimates that the average canal worker was just paid in around, I believe it is, 10 ounces of whiskey a day. And then they also got to spend their wages afterward on whatever they wanted. It's often more whiskey. Anyway, so that's always a fun story. In our Erie Eats exhibit, we are proud to have, and in our collection in general, we're proud to have this kettle. This picture doesn't do it justice because it makes it look like the kettle's relatively small. It's huge. This was owned by Christine Davis, who was actually a cook on the Erie Canal when it was being dug. Her husband was a laborer for a canal contractor, and she would do the cooking. She was hired by the contractor to cook for the entire work crew. So this kettle saw the construction of the Erie Canal, as well as her husband moved on to help dig the Ohio and Erie Canal, and as did Christine and her kettle. So this kettle was instrumental. Literally, it was an instrument used in digging both of those canals. Another interesting Foodways related story from the digging of the canal involves this man. This is Thomas James. During the time period the Erie Canal was being constructed, slavery was still entirely legal in New York State. It was not fully abolished until 1827, and Thomas James was born in Schoharie in about 1802, it's believed. He was born enslaved in Schoharie, typically doing, he was definitely doing, because the autobiography discusses it, I believe, farm labor, and this is fairly typical. We have a census from 1810 that shows that 1/3 of rural households in New York had an enslaved person within them, so that's a major percentage of the population, and those enslaved people were typically either doing farm work or serving as domestic servants, doing things like cooking or serving food. But anyway, Thomas James, like I said, born in Schoharie, lives in the Mohawk Valley for the first part of his life. When his original enslaver dies, he is traded for some farm implements and livestock to another gentleman who is apparently exceptionally cruel, whips Thomas, and he decided to flee to Canada and then gain his freedom that way. To do that, he was able to follow the recently mapped out, it had been staked out, the route of the Erie Canal. And along the way, he ran into a number of canal workers who were building the canal. Eventually gets to Lockport, then crosses the Niagara River into Canada, where he helps to dig the Welland Canal for a little while, but then moves back to America, ends up in Rochester, where he becomes, he starts out working in a canal side warehouse and eventually works his way up to managing that warehouse's entire freight operation. However, that's not the end of Thomas James's story. His true calling would be in the AME Zion Church. He became a minister in that and traveled all throughout the canal corridor, preaching as an incredibly influential abolitionist speaker. He actually ends up going out to Massachusetts, where he encourages a young Frederick Douglass to begin speaking. And he'll eventually end up playing a prominent role in the Civil War with newly freed people, and will eventually end his life again along the canal corridor in Rochester, I believe. So that's Thomas James, a really interesting character that we find about when we look into some of these Foodways related stories. Anyway, so the canal is built and it radically changes upstate New York. And it changes its foodways dramatically as well. In part, you have lots of new manufacturing and industrial uses for producing food and food-related objects. Here in the top corner, we see a great kind of, what's it called, montage. I don't think that's the right word. Amalgamation, sort of all the different processes involved in Syracuse's burgeoning salt industry. Syracuse is going to quickly become known as the Salt City, and at its peak was producing about 80% of the nation's salt was made right here in Syracuse. First by boiling it, but then when the land was largely deforested by evaporation in these gigantic salt pans. So that occurs. At the locks, especially, we see a lot of concentration of people as everyone waits to lock through. The traffic jam is sort of invented there, I like to say. And taking advantage of that, places like this spring up. This is a canal side grocery store. You could go in, get whatever you needed for your journey, mostly foodstuffs. Let's see, there's also an ice house here. You also, people forget, mules had to eat too, because the mules that were pulling the boats, I mean, that's a hard job. Probably get hungry, I think. Well, you definitely did. So the production of not just food for humans, but food to feed the thousands of work animals on the canal explodes as well. And if you read Carol Sheriff's great book, The Artificial River, she often talks about how when the canal went through people's property, especially when they built locks there, the state wouldn't compensate people for that because they were like, well, you can make a fortune on this grocery store. So that's an interesting little Foodways tidbit. Also springing up along locks are a number of taverns. I had a great quote from a traveler in the 1830s saying that there were, I believe, 3 to 4 groggeries per lock. And another missionary had found that there were 1,500 taverns and grocery stores selling alcohol along the route of the canal, which, if you do the math, that works out to about 1 every quarter of a mile. But again, they would concentrate at locks and, like here, in cities, in major locations along the canal, in the towns and eventually cities. This is an image of what is now Clinton Square in Syracuse, and you specifically looks at this building. This is the Syracuse House. So moving along the canal, in addition to a bunch of business people, there's tourists, but also these business people, they need places to stay, as do the tourists, and they will stay at places like this. Syracuse House is Syracuse's one of its first hotels, and hotels we'll see all along the canal corridor, and some, like the Syracuse House, are going to be really sumptuous affairs. They are some of the nicest lodgings in the whole town. Syracuse House will have at least 3 presidents, I believe, stay there. But in addition to having nice places to sleep, they also feed you incredibly good dinners, alcohols, though I know Charles Dickens, he hated Syracuse, and I believe he stayed at the Syracuse House. He did not enjoy his meal that he was given. But also at these locations, at the Syracuse House, we run into a gentleman by the name of Thomas Leonard, who was a canal boatman occasionally, but he eventually became a waiter at the Syracuse House. Thomas Leonard was a formerly enslaved person. He had been born in Maryland, found his freedom in New York, and found what many African Americans found as a relatively good job along the canal, working in one of these hotels as a waiter, or like his wife, Jane, who ended up working as a cook at another hotel here in Syracuse. Tom Leonard would become especially famous at the Syracuse House for helping to instigate the Harriet Powell rescue, one of the earlier and more famous Underground Railroad stories of the 1830s here in upstate New York. Moving on, I think the place that most encapsulates how radically the Erie Canal alters the foodways of upstate New York is Rochester, and that is because it is the unique confluence of both the Erie Canal and its easy transportation and the Genesee River, as well as the high falls of the Genesee, which we see here, which would power the machines that would make Rochester the nation's first boom town. And those machines are flour mills. We see one of Rochester's many flour mills here. The Genesee Valley was incredibly fertile, great for growing wheat in, and for a generation after the Erie Canal opens, the Genesee Valley is going to become the breadbasket of the nation. It produces just massive amounts of wheat, which are then shipped down the river to Rochester, where, thanks to these falls, they are able to process that flour, and Rochester just explodes in growth. I think I saw there was like a 350% increase in population in the decade after the canal is built, and that is largely to work these flour mills. This is when I wish I had my notes here, because I had the numbers on how much flour Rochester was producing. It was something like, I'm not even going to guess, because they're absurd numbers, but I don't want to make them too absurd or not absurd enough. But thousands and thousands of barrels of flour come out of Rochester. Whoops. And like I had said, the Hudson River had been initially producing a lot of, the Hudson River Valley had been producing a lot of the nation's wheat. Now they're getting outcompeted by all of this wheat coming out of Rochester in the Genesee Valley. So, like I said, the flour industry, like there are razor thin margins on how you become profitable at raising wheat and producing flour. And it stops being profitable for farmers in the Hudson Valley to produce wheat. So they start moving to more high value crops like fruits and dairy. Similarly, in other parts of the state that do not have the Erie Canal running through it, that had been important agricultural areas, like the southern tier around the Susquehanna River and the St. Lawrence Valley, they really just get horribly outcompeted by the Erie Canal. They stop having the agricultural prominence that they once had before the Erie Canal opens up. So it transforms these cities kind of economically, the economic bits of their foodways, but also we start seeing New York affected very much socially by these new forms of foodways, by new foodways that are arising. This is a great image I got from the Library of Congress showing the famous Harrison campaign of 1840. William Henry Harrison, he runs on kind of a working man's platform, if you will, or the common man. And his two symbols are a log cabin, and at those log cabins, which his supporters build all throughout the country, including we have accounts here in Syracuse, and I'm sure there were other ones along the canal. They build these log cabins. One of his symbols, where they do a great way to get votes, they distributed his other symbol, hard cider, which is a incredibly common drink in this area because certain parts of New York are great for growing fruits, especially apples. That's why the apple is New York State's state fruit. So hard ciders everywhere, and is really influencing even the politics. We've got food involved in politics. And on top of that, that brings me to far more impactful and far-reaching bit of foodways, and I guess we'll call it drinkways, maybe. Alcohol is incredibly prevalent, in case you can't tell, along the Erie Canal. People start taking note of that, and the temperance movement finds a ready home here along the canal corridor as well. This is a great object in our collection. It is a business card for the Home Temperance Restaurant. So, like I said, we had those hotels. They could often be kind of rowdy places. And if you were the type of person who believed in the temperance movement, you could go to a place like the Temperance Restaurant where you would hang out with a bunch of like-minded people. They wouldn't have any of that intoxicating alcohol there, and you would have a fun visit to Syracuse and not be accosted by any drunkenness, at least as long as you stayed in the hotel. Just stay away from kind of most of the canal. This is Hanover Square. Like I said, I forgot my notes, so I forgot why I put that in there. Anyway, we can see that a tremendous amount is changed by the Erie Canal, including their foodways. And New York becomes the Empire State as we open up the Erie Canal. Like I had mentioned, a lot of those kind of areas not directly along the main spine of the Erie Canal in New York, they start seeing an agricultural decline. They start demanding more canals of their own, and we get ones like the Black River Canal, the Shenango Canal, the Genesee River Canal, the Genesee Valley Canal, excuse me. Those folks producing wheat in the Genesee Valley, they really want to get their products to market even more efficiently. So they demand a canal. However, at the same time, other states saw like, hey, that canal thing kind of worked out well for New York, and they started digging canals. Remember I talked about Christine Davis. She moves right from the Erie Canal onto the O&E Canal, digging that. There are other canals, Amity in Ohio, the Wabash in the Erie Canal, so on and so forth. That start to have kind of the same effects that we see here along the Erie Canal. Now, none of these canals are as successful because railroads are also going to come in and sort of phase them out. They just were built too late in history to really have the exact same pronounced effect as the Erie Canal would, which is incredible, just like a decade or two difference and your canal is no longer viable. But these canals, the railroads that are going to exist, they feed settlement of these areas of white American settlement, and these areas have even more fertile soil, longer growing periods, more suitable climates, especially for things like wheat. So as the residents of the Genesee Valley are demanding this canal so they can more easily get their wheat, because they're the breadbasket of America, to Rochester to be turned into flour, these new states are starting to be able to compete with them. And remember, wheat has razor thin margins, and pretty soon, after about a generation, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio are going to be able to produce wheat much more efficiently than you will in the Genesee Valley, much more cheaply. That's the key. So this is going to become the breadbasket of America. And that Genesee Valley Canal is going to be not useless, but that intended purpose is gone. Wheat is going to quickly fall off as the primary product of the Erie Canal corridor. And instead, we're going to see the same thing that played out in the Hudson River Valley when the Erie Canal opened up, play out here in upstate New York along the canal corridor when these other areas of the nation are able to start producing wheat more efficiently. And that is, New York's going to transition to higher value crops. And here we see a number of images of some of those higher value crops. Dairy is going to become huge. Little Falls becomes known as the cheese capital of the world. The first cheese factory opens in 1850 in Rome, New York. Here we have an image from Canastota, Great Canal Town. They have unique geography, what are called mucklands, essentially swamps. I'm not an ecologist. I'm sure there is a difference between a swamp and a muckland. But they have the perfect growing conditions for onions and celery. This is a celery field in Canastota. Celery is going to be its primary focus for a while until they eventually transitioned to onions, which Canastota onions, you can still get them today. They're well known. In the hills to the south of the canal, you have the perfect environments for what these folks are harvesting: hops. The counties of Oneida, Madison, and Otsego counties are some of the largest They produce somewhere around 85% of the nation's hops around the mid-century mark. And with those hops, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'll talk a little about that. So Rochester, because of all that flour it produced, it has been known as the Flour City, Flour, as they stopped growing as much wheat in the Genesee Valley. That flour milling industry also starts to kind of dry up in Rochester. Buffalo becomes the major flour producing town as time goes by. So Rochester has to find a new way to make its living, and they start growing flowers. The nursery industry becomes huge in Rochester. This is actually a picture of gladiolas being grown in Syracuse, but you can see we start seeing these flower nurseries popping up along the canal as people focus on growing them, and Rochester becomes the flower city, Flower. Yeah, so there's that. Along Lake Ontario especially, there's a ton. They have great climate for growing fruits, so on and so forth. But all of these things need to be processed. I had mentioned that cheese factory in Rome. You'll also see in the later half of the century a ton of new factories springing up to further process food products. Here we see the famous beech nut factory in Schoharie, which still stands today. They can a number of things. Originally, they become famous for canning hams, but now they're mostly known for baby food, but they made a ton of food products. On top of that, in addition to just straight up processing food, like at this canning factory, there's the Merrill Sewell Canning Company here in Syracuse. They end up having 27 factories, many of which are located along the canal. And in fact, if you go to my former place of employment, Chittenango Landing Canal Boat Museum, they actually have the ruins of a Merrill Sewell canning factory that focused mainly on canning vegetables there. In fact, their visitor center is modeled after that factory. But anyway, on top of that, just general food processing, you also have a bunch of factories springing up to make the products that you're going to send to all those farms, perhaps out west. Here in Syracuse, we end up with the Syracuse Chilled Plow Company, which is a massive work. They produce thousands upon thousands of plows, as the name implies, but other farm implements as well. During my research, I also came across, well, I obviously hadn't come across this image. It wasn't like the first time I'd seen this picture before. This is a very iconic image of the canal out in Buffalo. However, I had never noticed that in the background are all of these harvesters. This is a factory that produced large farm equipment out in Rochester. I'm not in Rochester, in Buffalo. And I wish I had my notes here because I am drawing a blank on its name. So you've got these factories springing up. Remember those hotels? Those are still there. This is the other side of Clinton Square from where the Syracuse house was. This is the Empire House. And in those places, we start seeing restaurants to spring up. In part, still to serve those travelers, but also at these factories start concentrating groups of workers who now it's not as easy as it used to be in the old days when you used to, work at your house. So you took your lunch break at your house, or at least you worked within kind of walking distance of your house. You might be able to see in this image, Syracuse by this time, I believe, has electric trolleys all throughout the streets. So you're no longer kind of within easy distance of your house to get food. So this urban kind of workforce, they start going to restaurants more frequently, like the one that's going to form in the lower floor of the Empire House. It's one of Syracuse's more famous restaurants around the turn of the century. Many of those industrial workers are also immigrants. Here we have an image, and they have a major impact on the foodways of the canal. I can't not talk about the immigrant influence. This is a historic photo from the Hoffman Sausage Company. Frank Hoffman, an immigrant from Germany, comes over. He was trained as a butcher in Germany, takes those skills, starts producing his famous German franks, and you can still get a Hoffman German frank today. It is one of the iconic foodstuffs of the Erie Canal corridor. If you ask me, if you ask anybody in central New York, they're the best hot dogs. And don't even talk to me about Zweigels. I'm sure they have a fascinating history. I just don't want to hear it because Hoffman's is way better. But anyway, I talked about how we were producing a lot of hops. Those hops then get used to make beer. This is Greenway's brewing here in Syracuse. It was a 7-story, city block long brewery. This is the street view. On the backside is the canal for quick and efficient transportation. John Greenway was an English immigrant. He focused on making English beers, specifically ales and porters. There's actually going to become, in the late 1800s, here in Syracuse, what are known as the lager ale wars, as the Greenways and its English ales compete with a German brewery a little bit off the canal, Haberle's, which was a German brewery, and they produced lager. So those are some interesting immigrant connections. Another way the Germans, so this part's a bit German heavy at times. One of the other iconic meals, though, on the canal, the beef on wax sandwich, gets its start with immigrants along the canal. You see Buffalo had a very bustling waterfront, full of those taverns I mentioned. The tavern keepers, especially the German ones, who many of the immigrants congregated in that area around the waterfront in Buffalo. These tavern keepers, they want to provide their customers with something a bit more substantial than pretzels to go with their beer. So they were like, hey, let's make some kind of sandwich. Roast beef is very prominent in Germany, and they also knew about these rolls. These were known as Kemmelweck rolls. It's a German word for essentially caraway roll, which are also covered in salt. And these tavern keepers, they were smart. They caught on this. They get these salty buns as well as very salty roast beef, which then drove people to also get rather thirsty and buy the real moneymaker at a tavern, that beer. So I love the story of beef on weck as these immigrants, these brilliant tavern owners figure out, let's make the sandwich that will make people also drink and buy the most beer. Speaking of salt, here in Syracuse, generally credited to Irish immigrants who work in our salt flats here. The salt potato, another one of those iconic canal dishes. Workers in the salt fields, they take their potatoes and for lunch, toss them into the boiling salt brine, where they get this delicious salty crust on them, and thus is born the salt potato on the north side of Syracuse. A lot of other immigrant groups have major influences on, and continue to have major influences on the canal's foodways, notably Italians eat anything in Utica, I would say, like chicken riggies, Utica greens, heavily influenced by Italians, in Buffalo especially, but in many of the cities along the canal, large Polish populations. You can get a pierogi anywhere, that sort of thing. And there's many other immigrant groups who bring their own unique food customs to the canalway. During the 19th century. Also important for our foodways, springing up along the canal, moving along the canal largely, is the New York State Fair. One of the early proponents of the canal is a gentleman by the name of Elkanah Watson. He is often credited with inventing the county fair and those take off along the canal. And we often think of fairs kind of as these hokey things you can get like a deep fried Twinkie at, ride like a horribly unsafe roller coaster, that sort of thing. And then, you know, there's always like cows there. People are like, oh, look, cows, neat. But that's really the main purpose of these fairs originally, is for farmers to be able to take their products and showcase them, and for other farmers to learn like from those products. Like, they don't just give out like blue ribbons for chickens and cows for fun. That's so a farmer can be like, look, I have the best cow. You should have all of your cows breed with my cows, and you'll be able to produce more milk, more meat, etc. You'll have the best cows too. That sort of thing. We also see here, this is a great postcard from the New York State Fair. The Case Engine company was showcasing one of their tractors. You could watch all these different tractor demonstrations because you're going to need a tractor on your farm. So watch it. I know one of our docents here, she grew up on a farm, and she recounted how when they go to the fair, when she was a little kid, like her and her siblings, they would have fun just doing fair stuff. But they wouldn't see their father for the whole day because he had gone specifically to that agricultural section of the fair and was taking sort of like copious notes about like, oh, what are the good tractors I can get? What's the latest in farming technology? And these fairs are important for that. And here we have a great image of, it's an advertisement in one of the fair buildings. They were displaying a new type of flour that was so great at making pancakes, that sort of thing. So consumers also go and learn more about products and find out what was best for them. Now that this is a classic image of the canal showing the barge canal, but also what would kind of make especially the towpath era canal obsolete, railroads, and we also start seeing cars. I think it's great because it shows just how developed by sort of the turn of the 20th century America's infrastructure network had become its transportation network, which has a major effect on agriculture here in the state. Now, we've already seen what happened when the Midwest, they got good transportation. They were able to outproduce us in a lot of goods, but still, a place like Ohio is not optimal for growing things like hops, for instance. A place that is good for growing hops is Washington and Oregon. However, those places for most of the 1800s, it was very difficult to transport anything from, let's say, Oregon to Syracuse. So therefore, Syracuse was able to, they got their local hops. The hop industry was huge here in Syracuse, in central New York. This is just an example, but the same thing plays out, Texas, Florida, they have some areas that are incredibly fertile, have great growing seasons, can grow things like celery, presumably. This giant interconnected transportation network allows you to cheaply transport goods all over the country. So areas that are the optimal place for producing certain goods are going to make that, going to outcompete you, because now transportation costs aren't as much of a factor anymore, and farming really goes into decline in the mid 20th century, especially as these transportation routes become even more large. Though New York isn't going to try its hardest to not have that happen. In the back here, you see you've got boats being pulled by a steam tug, not a mule anymore. That's because in the early 1900s, New York embarks on building the barge canal that is largely pushed by flour interests in Buffalo and New York City, who fear that railroads will get a monopoly on flour transportation, and then they'll be able to charge them whatever they want to move that flour. And remember, flour is a game of cents. So they successfully lobby New York State to build this new and improved, much larger canal. And you can see the influence that the grain and flour had. You have these gigantic grain silos all kind of along a lot of barge canal terminuses. Notably, there's the one at Kiwanis Bay. And in the mid-30s, several million pounds of grain were moving along the barge canal's waters that would drop off eventually. And following World War II, these interconnected transportation networks and the cheapness of food, people start being like, well, let me just get kind of whatever's cheapest, and it tastes fine. A lot of upstate New York canal corridor businesses either go out of business because they are not able to adapt to this new kind of landscape where you have to just make big facilities that make the most cost-effective product that people want to buy. Some do adapt. I think one of the perfect examples is the Genesee Brewing Company. A lot of people here in upstate New York, we know the Genesee Cream Ale. They're not great, some might say, but Genesee is able to survive this changing world by adapting to consumer demands. And in the 1950s and 60s, that's things like cream ales, like light beers, and they successfully do it. They make this product that is sort of homogenized. There's not a huge difference between probably a Genny Light and a Bud Light, and that they're able to hang on in sort of a regional market by expanding, becoming bigger, and producing things that the consumer wants. And there's a lot of other kind of companies like this. I just went with Genny because it felt like an obvious one to go with. But that trend starts to get reversed starting in kind of the 1970s. People start thinking like, hey, I'd like my food to taste good. Also, where did this come from? How are they making it? Those technological innovations we were talking about at fairs, at some point, people start going to fairs with like, hey, here's like this chemical you can spray on your plants, and no bugs will ever be able to survive within 10 feet of it, that sort of thing. And people are like, huh, if that stuff kills all these bugs, what is it doing to me? That people start questioning that. Other people are like, man, I wish I had something that wasn't Gen Z light to drink. Or, you know, I would like food not to be, you know, an Oscar Mayer hot dog or a TV frozen dinner. They want that just came from somewhere, some random farm. And towards the end of the 20th century, we start seeing a movement towards more local foods again. We see things like the farm to table movement. We start seeing the organic food movement. People start becoming vegans and vegetarians more often. And now, here in the 21st century, those food trends have really taken over in a lot of places. And I wanted to highlight a few areas that really, right here in Syracuse, that kind of encapsulate a lot of those trends. One is the Evergreen. That is a block and a half away from the museum. It's located in the oldest building in downtown Syracuse, the Phoenix Block, which was a historic canal-side building. You can enter on both sides, one on Erie Boulevard and one on Water Street. It was a double-ender. They focus on producing farm-to-table, locally grown products, many of which are organic or vegan in their options. So the Evergreen is a great place. They also focus a lot on what we have down here, craft beers that are also locally made. This is Talking Cursive Brewing, which is actually on the former location of the Greenways Brewery that we discussed. I really wanted to highlight them because they have partnered with us to make our own Erie Canal beer. Good old pale ale on that historic site of the canal side brewery. So that was a cool partnership that we had. It's one of, I believe, 7 breweries in Syracuse alone. New York recently got over 1,000 craft beverage producers in the last couple of years. And finally, there is this great market. This is the Salt City Market. It's right here in downtown Syracuse, and it highlights the continued influence of immigrant cuisines on this great canal town. It has a number of restaurants that show the diversity of foodways. You have here Miss Prissy's, that's a soul food restaurant. You've got Big in Burma, that is the first Burmese restaurant here in Syracuse. And from interviews I've been doing as part of this project, the Burmese population along the canal corridor is huge and incredibly influential. It's especially very important nowadays in the agriculture industry. Got a Vietnamese restaurant here, Middle Eastern cuisine. That was the juice bar. They make juice. They're not really an ethnic. They're one of the rare ones that aren't super ethnic cuisine or anything. So that's the state of kind of the canal corridor now. You've got a lot more emphasis on farm to table, on celebrating the diversity of our cuisines, on making stuff that tastes good, that sort of thing, and you know where it came from, supporting the local economy, etc. So is the talk. Yeah, I definitely rambled at points there. This again didn't have my notes, but I hope you enjoyed it. And good, I only went 15 minutes over. So.
Thank you, Derek. And off of that last slide there, we were discussing, it does give me a couple ideas. The next time I'm out there visiting the museum in Syracuse, I've got to make it to the Erie Eats exhibit and probably chat with you a little bit while I'm there. So I will have to come up with a different location where we have lunch than my standard, my usual. So you're giving me some good ideas there. If anybody that's on wants to throw a question up in the chat, that's fine. I was going to point out a couple things, a little bit of, if you don't mind, my slight tangent slash shameless self-promotion for Schoharie across from here. You mentioned BeachNut as a processing facility, and that's here in Montgomery County. BeachNut has moved out of Onondaga and is up on it's kind of a regional economic development area of Route 5S, two distribution centers and such. But that building, as you mentioned, it still stands. They're doing a lot of work and repurposing the former BeachNut facility, moving forward into a few different projects, office space, and apparently a marijuana facility is on the list. So that is a new form of, I guess, it might be incorporated in Foodways. Wow. But I do want to also point out, because you shared an image later that features the railroad, the barge, and a car, the telegraph lines, which harkens very well into a painting that is housed in the Erie Canal Museum in Canterbury, which is right across from the old BeachNut facility, and is actually started by the Arkell family of BeachNut and the bag fame. So you can find a video of myself and Mary Alexander from the Arkell talking about the art, the Erie Canal art of their collection, also on YouTube. So there's a shameless plug for that. I appreciate the opportunity to shamelessly plug another one of our programs that has already happened and drive some more audience to it. So, and there's other cool stuff, like there's a nice connection with James being born in Schoharie and Underground River, Montgomery County, Montgomery County historian. Kelly Farquhar has a wonderful brochure with information on the Underground River in Montgomery County and in the area as well. And he brought up the wonderful importance of recognizing some of the compensation to families and their ability to be entrepreneurial spirited New Yorkers by establishing lock groceries or other businesses along the canal, which we had to here. Obviously, it was along the entire canal.
I really enjoyed in the artificial river. When Carol Scher was talking about that, like there were farmers in New York who the state was like, "Oh, we'll put a lock on your property so we don't have to pay you because you can build a grocery." And they were like, "Well, farmer, I don't want to be a grocer."
Right.
It's tough. You gotta find someone who does.
Like here, the Enders family gets compensated. They go to a grocery next to one of the lots, and then when they move the canal for any enlargement, they get compensated for having the lot moved, and therefore their grocery is no longer a viable business. But yeah, it's always kind of nice. Or we'll compensate. I believe Sheriff's book also talks about down a little bit further some of the eel fishing and how they made some adjustments to the development of the canal. To allow for eel fishing because it was a livelihood of that particular constituency.
Right. And I just want to emphasize that people really should come on down to the museum to check out the Erie Eats exhibit if you can, because I tried to pack a lot of what's in the exhibit into this talk, but I left out a lot of stuff. I know you're talking about eels sparked something for me. One of our panels has something about eels. I can't remember what exactly.
And something else, people should get there to see the treadmill.
Yes. Oh yeah. Our dog treadmill. That's a fun one, which was used for kind of marginal farm labor. Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's a lot of cool stuff you'll see at the exhibit. You have several loans from New York State Museum as well. I have to thank them for all their help on this exhibit as well.
And so the exhibit's open and it runs until the end of the year. You want to give us some time on that? When the availability?
Right. Yep. So the Erie Eats exhibit is up until October 31st. We're open here at the museum from 10 to 4 every day. And you don't need to make a reservation anymore. We've got rid of that requirement recently. So feel free to just drop in and check out that exhibit, which occupies the second floor of the Waylock building, as well as the rest of the Erie Canal Museum.
Awesome. And make sure you check out the barge that's in the Waylock. Respectfully check it out. Enjoy the content. There's some food content inside the barge, if I recall. And I would suggest people make it a point to head out that way. Check out the Erie Eats exhibit at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. Work up a nice hunger and then hit some of those downtown establishments or local establishments to eat some good food. Derrick, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to touch base with you a little bit later about some other stuff that's going on. So thank you so much for Lunchbox Lesson 4.
Yes, sounds good. And hey, if anyone out there is watching, register for the World Canal Conference. You can see Dave and I present.
Another shameless plug.
Yeah. Like this, pay a few $100s to go to Hagerstown.
There's so much to see down there. I was looking around and I regret that I'll only be down there for a couple of days. There's so many great things that I want to go check out. And yeah, so there's the World Canal Conference in Hagerstown, Maryland, end of August, early September. Register for that. Or if you don't want to travel out of state, end of September, the New York State Canal Conference being put on by the Canal Society of New York will be in Schenectady. So you can check out the websites for that. I'll put those in the links later on. If this is up on another form of social media. But yeah, if you can make it Hagerstown, definitely get there because then you can see Derrick and I in person. It'll be great.
Who knows? Go ahead, go to Harper's Ferry with me. All right. Anyway, I'll see you guys later.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Yep.
You are.
Bye.